Welcome, everyone, to this wonderful book launch, marking the centenary of Donald Davie's birth, and also marking the publication of a wonderful new selected poems, which has been put together for us by Sinead Morrissey, and Sinead will be joining me to celebrate this book in just a moment. First of all, I'm standing in for our normal hostess, who is indisposed today, but is actually, thank goodness, pulling the strings behind the scene. I should deal with some housekeeping first. Tonight will last about an hour. We're always good at timekeeping. We don't like to keep you from Coronation Street. Please note that at the foot of your screen, you have a chat box, and we'd like to hear from you to find out where you are, what you're thinking about the readings and about the discussion. And you can also comment there on qualities of the poetry. Change it from to general so that everyone can read your chat. The Q&As, put your questions and questions in the Q&A box, please, and we will deal with those towards the end of the discussion when you'll be able to ask Sinead, who edits the book, questions about the collection and about the poems. Yes, change your default for in the chat to everyone, otherwise we won't be able to, no one will be able to see what you're saying. We will be showing you, as usual, the text of the poems that we're reading on the screen. And you have control over your screen. So you can actually, if you want to watch Sinead read rather than watch the text go by, you can make her large and the text small just by fiddling with your boxes. And I always like to see the text. And it's always a pleasure to watch Sinead as well. Drop any technical questions you may have into the chat box, and they will be dealt with. And drop your Q&As into the Q&A box, please. You will receive an email tomorrow from Jazz, our string-pulling hostess behind the scene, who will tell you how to acquire a copy of this wonderful book. And you can acquire more than one copy if you wish. The chat will be left on a little bit after the event, so that you can chat with one another and possibly with us a bit beyond the time limit. Now, what will happen is that I thought I would talk very briefly about how I met Donald Davie and how Donald Davie and I worked together for many years, and then bring Sinead on to talk about how she, as it were, encountered him first. And then we will have the reading and a more general discussion. Donald Davie discovered me rather than me discovering him, in the sense that I wrote a review of one of his dearest friends and a poet whose work he advocated all his life, Charles Tomlinson. I wrote a review of Charles Tomlinson, John Silkin, George Macbeth, Geoffrey Hill in Poetry Magazine, Poetry Chicago. And Tomlinson was at that time still very much a controversial figure, and not many critics had really identified his qualities. And Don was very pleased to see that I had taken the work seriously. He wrote to me and thanked me for the review because he loved to see the poets that he liked being praised and being brought to court, as it were. He came to England, he was already teaching at Stanford, I believe, at the time, and he brought me a copy of this book, Thomas Hardy and British Poetry. At the time, I had read Purity of Diction in English first, and I had a copy of Articulate Energy, which I hadn't yet read. He inscribed the book for Michael Schmidt, Donald Davie, 3 November 1972. And I loved the book. What I loved about this particular book, at the time I hadn't read his poems, was that the distinction he was making between thematic irony and stylistic irony, something that hadn't really occurred to me, talking really about his own generation of being ironist in style, whereas for Hardy, for Hausman, and even for Kipling, irony was the way the world faced us, not the way we face the world. And this notion of thematic irony pervades his own work as well, though he is a great ironist in style. I started reading his poems, and in 1977 published 2 books by Donald. One was his The Poet in the Imaginary Museum, a huge book of essays, which began with essays from the 50s and ended with essays from the 70s. A book that I typeset myself on my IBM electronic typesetter, and his first book of poems, In the Stopping Train, the first book of poems that we did. He left Routledge and came to Carcanet. And so that was my first encounter with him. We corresponded at least every week, sometimes more than once a week. I put him in touch with Charles Sisson, T.H. Sisson, who is my absolute favorite poet even now. And they joined up with me later on with PN Review, which C.B. Cox, my professor here in Manchester, and they and I edited. So that's to say, Donald, Davie, and Carl Sisson are at the very root of my enterprise, both as a publisher, as a writer, and as a critic. And I really loved Donald's work, even though I differed with it more and more as the years passed. Sinead, will you come to us, as it were? Can you materialize? Sinead is about to materialize, I hope.
Can you hear me, Michael?
I can hear you, but I can't see you yet. Will you please? There you are. Excellent. Lovely to see you. Now we come. When did you first, and how did you first encounter Donald Davie? I know.
Yeah, it was really interesting. John McAuliffe approached me initially and asked me if I would consider doing a new selected of Donald Davie. And obviously I knew the name. I'd read a couple of poems. I was very aware that he was, one of the great poet critics of his generation, but I didn't actually know that much about his poetry when John asked me to do this. And he'd mentioned about Davie's various he moved around and wrote from so many different places, and he was in Ireland briefly. In fact, he taught at Trinity College, where I went to university, so there was that connection. And then, he was in California for many years and came back. So he had a peripatetic, existence, which I have had. So that was kind of a point of connection. And then I was just interested to find out more. John McAuliffe had mentioned that there was a kind of central engagement with Russian poets of the 20th century at the heart of Davie's work, which he imagined I would find quite interesting, and he was spot on about that. That was something I latched onto very early on in my reading. So I wanted to find out more about this kind of huge figure who seemed to be just over my shoulder. And you and I, Michael, had a chat very early on at the beginning of the summer about how this might proceed, and you sent me a lot of invaluable material. So that included Neil Powell's definitive collective poems from 2002, and that is the definitive Davie volume, and also the two early books of criticism, so Purity of Diction in English Verse and Articulate Energy, which he wrote and published very early on, close to his first collection in the 1950s, and which Carcanet, of course, had reproduced as a single volume. So I read that, and I also read Davie's own selected poems, and that was interesting. I didn't read that until I had, gone through the collected several times and kind of come to a kind of early idea of the poems that I would like to choose. So it was interesting at that point to come to Davie's selection, which stopped, of course, way before Davie did. So there was that whole tranche of writing his own selected. But it was interesting just to see the points of convergence and divergence between what I had kind of picked out completely fresh from my engagement with collected poems and what he had chosen much earlier on. And sometimes we coincided, but actually more often we didn't. So I thought, that was very interesting. And there were lots of gems I found that were kind of hidden in the collected poems that I wanted to bring out and shine a light on. So I suppose when you make a selection from someone who wrote for as many decades as Davie did, and as many collections as Davie did, and wrote so variously, you know, the question you have to ask yourself is, what story of Davie do you want to tell? Because multiple stories are, of course, possible. So this is a very personal selection. And in his introduction, Neil Powell to The Collected, Neil Powell very interestingly said, you know, Donald Davie and Philip Larkin may have started in a similar place. They were both born in 1922. So this is the centenary year of both poets. You know, may have started in that 1950s movement beginning, but they, you know, they certainly didn't, you know, Davie did not end there. And he said to have, you know, to try and whittle down Davie's oeuvre into an equivalent 3 slim volumes, which was, you know, Larkin's output. You could do it, but it would ultimately be, you know, a diminishing kind of exercise because of the variousness and the amount and the complexity of Davie's work. So, you know, I had to acknowledge in my introduction, you know, this is the equivalent, you know, this is the equivalent of Larkin's 3 slim volumes. And so my hope for it would be that it would be a way into Davie's complete work, and yeah, that it would shine a light on maybe aspects of his work that haven't had the same attention. And I was really drawn by well, I was surprised on a number of counts as I went through The Collected. The thing that surprised me most was how open Davie was to change. So, you know, he starts with very old-fashioned, even in his time, very old-fashioned admiration of the Augustans. I've called them the dusty Augustans in my introduction, you know, and he wrote very, like you said in the obituary, Michael, that was published on his death, he had an almost unnaturally austere beginning. And so what was very interesting was from that, and even within those sort of tightly rhymed metrical quatrains, I thought you could see unusual things happen. And that only became more and more as he progressed, and as he kind of allowed influences to come in and kind of change him while holding his own steer. And I think what he achieved was a kind of stupendous act of balance between being hospitable and following his own course. So I really like that, and I wanted to show the kind of the dramatic change in his work across that whole trajectory. So my selected starts with his first extant poem, Pelican, and ends with the sequence Our Father, which was published, I believe, posthumously in Peer Review just after his death. And, you know, it features everything in between. So highlights what simmered to the top for me in terms of highlights from that wide span of work. Yeah, so I kind so that was a kind of principle to show that. The other question and we talked about this, Michael, I remember in our very early conversations, but there was something about what are you going to do about the sequences? Yes. And Davie as a poet, I think this is remarkable about him, but he was very interested in the processes of his own mind and in kind of atomizing that. And I think, so you see a thinking mind as a presence in the poems themselves. And that thinking mind definitely thought in sequences, you know, so extended meditations around a single subject broken into compartments. And so, but what do you do in a slim volume? And I kind of made a decision early on that not too many of those sequences, I think vitally important though they are, that they would dominate too much. And I also made a decision early on that I couldn't pull sections of them because they really coalesced as units of a single poem in each case. So I kind of came down on that side in terms of the sequence question as well. And then, yeah, that's what you have. So you have a personal sense of these pivotal poems and pivotal axle points around which his creative practice changed. And that's the kind of story I've tried to draw out and celebrate.
So it's the kind of the lyric, Davie, up to a point. Though there's a lot of argument in the book as well, isn't there? There's a lot
yeah. And this is a dichotomy that, you know, he teases it apart very, very early on in terms of what he kind of frames it in different ways. But one of the ways in which he frames the dichotomy is between syntax or contextualizing material and pure image. So he kind of sets up a sort of conflict between, say, the Augustans and, well, Pound. You know, he talks about Pound a lot, and the pure imagistic tendency of that modernist movement. And what's so interesting is he makes a great case for syntax and contextualizing material early on. He makes a great case against actually what William Carlos Williams would establish as a kind of orthodoxy in contemporary poetics, you know, the emphasis on the detail, on the thing, on the specific, as opposed to the abstract and the lofty and the idea-based kind of rumination. And yet what really interested me then, having read that critical background, is how much he brings his poetry to earth without losing that kind of philosophical, probing questioning, which at all times involves a kind of scrupulous honesty. And I really liked his honesty in terms of temptation. And by that I don't mean kind of, you know, bodily temptation or anything like that. He had a temptation towards the rigors of aesthetics, really, and that kind of consolation afforded by form and by, you know, clean edges. He always characterizes light as having a hard, clean edge. And, you know, at the same time, he forces himself out of honesty to kind of write against his own inclinations, a bit like Yeats did in his, you know, in his later period. And he puts problematic things in which kind of always complicate that consolation. So he kind of, he sees it and he wishes for it, but he doesn't allow himself it because it is ultimately dishonest. And I think that meant for a very, very kind of rich poetic, which was open to complexity.
And that goes right through his poetry, doesn't it? It continues. Do you want that? What you just said, of course, leads beautifully into Prima's abstract. So you might as well. Should we plunge in?
Yeah, sure. I'm fine to begin. Yeah. So this is a very early poem. Typically, I think for Davie, it is a poem which becomes a poem about poetry itself. He was abidingly preoccupied with poetry. He took it terribly, terribly seriously in a way which I actually find quite old-fashioned and very confident that he says at one point in his criticism, poetry is necessary for the survival of our civilization. And I found that an almost breathtaking statement. He may well be right, but I do not have that confidence in it. You know, I am much more preoccupied, I think, with the globe, you know, with the planetary crises. But yeah, so that's at the center of it. He thought that this was fundamentally important to the survival of civilization. And so when he writes poems, you know, they're always poems about poetry. They're always sort of manifestos on some level. And this one is really interesting. It's very early. And what I love about this first poem that I've chosen to read is his model of the poem. You know, not as a machine or not as a body, but as he calls it a grid that hoists a charge. And he was tremendously interested in electricity and in wind, and images of electricity and wind are all the way through the work. And this idea of kind of a dynamic interchange, you know, between reader and poet, and also within the poem, as the poem kind of takes these leaps from a starting point to a surprising endpoint. Also in the trajectory of his whole work, you know, that you could not predict certain poems were going to be by Davie by reading the early work. It's completely surprising in that way. And so I just love this. I love this model of what a poem can be as essentially a structure that enables the transference of dynamic energy. And that's what this poem describes. So poem as abstract. To write about a tree, you must first be a tree. W.R. Rogers. 1. A poem is less an orange than a grid. It hoists a charge. It does not ooze a juice. It has no rind, being entirely hard. All drumming yards and open, it asserts that clouds have way upon them, and that hills breast into time behind a singing strut. A sheer abstraction, apt upon the grass of London parks, has emulated oak and it the ramage that it could surpass. That construct, ribbed with wire across a kern, is caging such serenity of stress as boughs or fruit that breaks them cannot learn. For gods are gathered from the styles they wear, and do they curl a fetus in a fruit, or like Orion pinned upon the air? 2. No trialed matron, but a rigger's mate. The pile-high poet has no time to brood. He steps the mast. It does not germinate. Not for ingestion, but to frame the air, he flies the spar that even winter's tree in green ambition cannot grow so spare. The orange dangles, drops, and comes again. To make a fruit, he has to be a fruit, a globe of pulp about a pit of pen. But tiptoe cages lofted in a day, to make a grid, he has to make a grid, have come unprecedented and to stay. If poems make a style, a way of walking with enterprise, should not a poet's gait be counties wide, this stride the pylons stalking?
I really love the way you drew the sound patterns out of that, especially the second half. It's an astonishingly constructed poem. But
yes, it is. I mean, it is. It's an astonishingly constructed poem. And I'm not sure if I said this, you know, if some poets are born, other poets are made. Davie made himself. And I think you get such a sense of kind of the hard work involved in this. You know, you have to be a tree, you have to make the grid. And that's exactly what he did. But it is a beautiful construction in air, I think, poem as abstract.
It's a romantic poem, isn't it? But a totally anti-romantic stance. It's a very strange.
Yes, a very inorganic stance, isn't it? You know, it's in terms of it's in favor of structure over or organic growth. I mean, that's the dichotomy that runs all the way through. But I just love that poem. And then the second poem I'm going to read is one of these little gems I felt that were just, you know, I don't think he would have ever selected it, but I just thought it had a kind of loveliness about it. And it shows, you know, his huge range and diversity. So this is, it's called Love Poems. I think that's pronounced Mary, but I'm not sure, Michael. Maybe you know, from Mary McInnes?
That will do.
Yeah. All these love poems. Love in its place is simple, therefore interesting. Inscrutable face, looming through leaves or water, unlooked for isle or island. It is not the whole story, nor can stand for such as human relations in little. It is not so much a paradigm as an interruption, not to be looked for in a day's travel. And all these, some civilized, some frenzied, some gravely moving, but yours surprised, still dazzled in the roasted glade, astounded after long days in the forest.
Yes, my first poem is a love poem, and one of the very few love poems that Donald wrote. And I think he was always rather puzzled that he had written this poem. It came out of, I think, his first deep encounter with Pasternak. And it is a lyric in a way that almost none of his other poems is a lyric. Chaz, can we move on to Time Passing Beloved? Oh, here we are. There it is. Time passing and the memories of love coming back to me, Carissima, no more mockingly than ever before. Time passing, unslackening, unhastening, steadily, and no more bitterly beloved, the memories of love coming into the shore. How will it end? Time passing and our passages of love as ever beloved blind, as ever before. Time binding, unbinding about us, and yet to remember never less chastening, nor the flame of love less like an ember. What will become of us? Time passing, beloved, and we in a sealed assurance unassailed by memory. How can it end, this siege of a shore that no misgivings to feel, no doubt to defend? I love the relaxed way he uses the rhyme, the mockingly rhyming with unslackening, and then the unbinding rhyming with blind, and then find sealed and unassailed. It was the B rhymes, as it were, doing such interesting things. But back to you now, Sinead, for your gardens.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about a poem like that. It really it just shows his versatility, really, that this poem is part of that. You know, that he could do this as well as he could do so many other different types of poems. I think it's really beautiful. So the next poem I'd like to read is Gardens No Emblems. And I think this poem fascinated me because it's so hyper conscious of the poet's task. You know, the poet's task is to try and find a form to fit experience into. And you know, it's a beautifully made thing, but as I think with the very best artifacts, this is a poem which in a way acknowledges its own redundancy. And the imagery of light as hard-edged, you know, a line, this comes back, this recurs again and again all the way through, you know, light as inexorable. It's like a kind of, you know, it's kind of an Apollo characteristic of light, you know, and it is an absolute. And the opposite, the corollary to that all the way through, I think, is the wind, which is very disruptive and kind of blows the formal assurance off kilter very often, and is valued for doing that. So I like the way this is so well wrought, but acknowledges within that space how difficult and how potentially ruinous that can be. Gardens No Emblems. Man with a scythe, the torrent of his swing finds its own level and is not pulled back, but gathers fluently like water rising behind the water gates that close a lock. The gardener eased his foot into a boot, which action like the mower's had its mould, being itself a sort of taking root, feeling for lodgment in the leather's fold. But forms of thought move in another plane, whose matrices no natural forms afford, unless subjected to prodigious strain. Say, light proceeding edgewise like a sword. You know, and the violence done to experience by formal constraint is so brilliantly acknowledged, I think, there in that final image. Yeah.
It's funny what you were saying about the leak that come later. In a way, the language of the sequence is certainly starting within the stopping more musical, much less contrived than it is here. In a curious way, too, our selection of the poems, I think, favors the earlier over the later, because you need the larger space to have the less constructed effect. By the way, I keep getting a message here telling me that my internet is slightly dubious. So if I disappear, it's all yours, Sinead. Don't worry, I haven't. Am I still here? Tell me if I stop moving.
Yeah, you're still here. You're still here, Michael. No problem.
Oh, good. Green River is my next.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I just wondered if you were next. I think you are.
I am next. If I have a little list here, which you're after me, okay? Green River, green silk, or a shot silk, blue verging to green at the edges. The river reflects the sky, alas. I wish that its hue were the constant green of its stages, or the reeds it is floating by. It reflects the entrances, dangers, exploits, vivid reversals of weather over the days. But it learns to make these changes by too many long rehearsals or of overcasts and grays. So let it take its station less mutably. Put it to school, not to the sky, but the land. This endless transformation, because it is beautiful, let some of it somehow stand. But seeing a streak of it quiver there in the distance, my eye is astonished and unbelieving. It exclaims to itself, forever, this water is passing by. It arrives and it is leaving. What you were saying before about paradoxes, this is one of those astonished paradoxes where there is no arrest, there is no status, though that's what the poem is longing for and trying to create in some way.
And again, it acknowledges its own redundancy at the end in that cannot happen. Do you know, it can only be an aspiration. And yet somehow it has happened, you know, somehow it has been stopped and caught and the time continuum has been arrested and we've got the moment.
But only in the poem. Yes. Over to you for Across the Bay.
Yeah. So the next poem, Across the Bay, I think this is one of the ones when I was reading through the collected and I read this and I loved it. It stopped me in my tracks, really. And again, we have so many of the kind of contrasts and paradoxes which have come up through these poems so far. We have the light and its hard edge contrasted so forcefully and so disturbingly with these kind of jellyfish on the beach that he's really troubled by, these sources of venom, and described as, you know, hurting and going on hurting. And I think, you know, it's a very strange landscape poem that encapsulates his own kind of wish to escape from human suffering, his own. It's you know, it's messy and it's persistent and it's intractable and it's really bothersome. And there's, you know, there's a pleasure in things which are not that external to the self, and neater than that. And he acknowledges all of that longing, but he doesn't allow himself to really go there. And I think the final line is, I think it's one of the most stunning final lines of any poem he wrote. Across the bay. A queer thing about those waters. There are no birds there, or hardly any. I did not miss them. I do not remember missing them or thinking it uncanny. The beach, so-called, was a blinding splinter of limestone, a quarry outraged by hulls. We took pleasure in that, the emptiness, the hardness of the light, the silence, and the water's stillness. But this was the setting for one of our murderous scenes. This hurt and goes on hurting. The venomous, soft jelly, the undersides. We could stand the world if it were hard all over. It's just I think it's such a stunning sort of final line, you know. Not tolerate, not love, stand, you know, we could stand the world if it were hard all over. And it's not, and the poem acknowledged that it's not. And then where are you? You know, yeah, I think that's a really startling kind of poem.
It works so well with the eighth line of the light, the silence, and the water stillness, putting in the conjunction there, and so which it could be just the series, but
yeah,
and the water stillness, which shows the kind of emphasis on stillness, but not hardness. And
you know, there was a few times when there's another poem coming up which the same thing happens, but you know, I couldn't stop thinking about a queer thing about those waters. There are no birds there, or hardly any. You know, I couldn't think of, you know, the way that the bird flu epidemic at the moment has killed off so many seabirds, and you know, I couldn't help but think about the biodiversity crisis and the natural world around us falling increasingly more silent. You know, it has those kind of uncanny prophetic resonances too, and I think that is a very relevant point of connection for readers today of Davie's work.
I think the next poem, In Chopin's Garden, does the same sort of thing, because as I was rereading it to make the choice for today, I was really surprised at how it seemed to relate to the Ukraine. I mean, the geography is nearby, if you like, but also some of the movements that are happening in the poem are political. And obviously he is himself profoundly moved by history, especially Eastern European history at this point. And you feel a connection. It's a love poem. It is also a poem about art, as always, but also I think a poem about politics. So in Chopin's Garden, I remember the scarlet sets of the little frequented highway from Warsaw to the west and Chopin's house one Sunday. I remember outside the windows as the pianist plucked a ring from her thin white finger, the rows of unanchored faces waiting, and a climbing vapor, storm rack wreathing up, heavy with fruit, darkened the skies at their back on the old invasion route. Masovia bows its birches resignedly. Again, a rapid army marches eastward over the plain. And fast now it approaches, turbulence, agonies, as the poised musician broaches the polonaise, storm from the keys. See them, ennobled by the mass and passage, these faces stained with the sky, supple and fluid as trees. And the other thing that came strongly to my mind was in the station of the metro here, the faces and the apparition of the faces in the crowd. And I somehow felt there was some curious connection between the poem is about music. The poem is also about receiving music and in these circumstances and from these his geography. It was a very powerful, weird poem, which again ties into the present inadvertently, like your Seaburn poem.
And I think, for someone who said very early on about himself, I am not a natural poet. My mind moves more easily among abstractions. He says
Yes.
that about himself, but it's so clearly not true. We are so located within this description. I think he was extremely good on the resonant detail and on scene building, though he said he wasn't.
This is the poem I think which I've loved first of his when I started reading his poetry, July 1964, which again is laceratingly self critical, if you like, or self aware. I think. I smell the smell of death. Rethke, who died last year, with whom I drank in London, wrote the book I am reading. A friend of a firm mind has died, or is dying now, a telegram informs me. The wife of a neighbor died in 3 quick months of cancer. Love and art I practice. They seem to be worth no more and no less than they were. The firm mind practiced neither. It practiced charity vocationally and, yet, for the most part, truly. Rethke, who practiced both, was slack in his art by the end. The practice of an art is to convert all terms into the terms of art. By the end of the third stanza, death is a smell no longer. It is a problem of style. A man who ought to know me wrote in a review, my emotional life was meager. That's a very brutal ending. And one wonders whether he is proving the critic wrong or concurring with the critic, because the art is so foregrounded here. But it's a very powerful poem.
It's a very powerful poem. I think it's a completely, personally, I read that ending as ironic, and I think that the poem is kind of it's so passionate about the problem of aestheticization of experience. I think it's really devastating to say the practice of an art is to convert all terms into the terms of art. By the end of the third stanza, death is a smell no longer. It is a problem of style. I think that is laceratingly critical. And it is a criticism in which he himself is implicated, I think that's kind of an amazing poem. For the way the movement that he makes from where he starts to where he ends, it's extremely dynamic and it's lacerating, I think.
I think we've dealt mainly with poems that were written before he went abroad. In fact, almost all the poems we've chosen were written before he went abroad. Isn't that strange? Is that true? Maybe not. Anyway, back to you.
Well, did he? When did he leave? He left after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, didn't he? Is that when he went to America? So it was 1968.
Didn't he go to America after he was in Dublin?
He's kind of.
When did
he went back to England and then left.
Was Essex after London? Was that no? Essex was not after Dublin, was it? Essex was.
Yes, it was.
Okay.
And then after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then from there he went to the United States. I think what you get through these middle poems that we're reading now is there's an accommodation with what is not ideal, there's a kind of, here very brutally there's a kind of look at what art leaves out, that is unconscionable. But there's also an increasing kind of preparedness to let the unideal into his experience and to acknowledge it. And he didn't, I don't, from the poems, I mean, I don't know so much about from the biography, but from the poems, it seems he wasn't very happy in the fens. He moved from the north down, and he opens the poem by saying, I don't want to live here, but I do, I have to, and I do. And that kind of falling to earth is reluctantly brought in, and he makes art out of it. He makes art out of that unideal state. And yeah, I like that too. I like that he's done that.
Sinead,
I
I'm
think
going to leave
it
you
makes for a better, it makes
Yes.
for a richer poetic that he does that.
Will you continue, please, with Sunburst and your other two poems while I quickly make myself absent, but come back very quickly. Be right back. You go ahead.
So the next one I picked is Sunburst. So the same concerns that we've been talking about are present in this poem. This kind of, again, this characterization of light as a kind of weapon and as entirely hard-edged and inexorable. But what I really like here, you kind of see how his reading, his deep engagement with Russian poets in the Russian language. He taught himself Russian when he was stationed in the high Arctic during the Second World War, and he continued to teach himself Russian. So he was able to read 20th century Russian poets in the original language, and he had a particular engagement with Pasternak. And I think as you see that influence play out in his work, you get a very playful use of syntax in which the main verb is often delayed. And I think in his own configuration of what syntax is or what syntax can do, he understood it ideally as a transference of force or energy. And he had this idea that the really powerful sentence was the transitive sentence, in which energy was transferred from a subject to an object via a transitive verb. And so this kind of displacement of force or movement of energy, transmutation across, was something that he was really interested in. And I think you get a kind of manipulation of syntax increasingly from this point on, which is very playful and which is trying to control or delay or intensify energy. And so I picked that because I think this is an example of that particular use of syntax coming to the fore. Sunburst. The light wheels and comes in over the seawall, and the bitten turf that not only wind has scathed, but all this wheeling and flashing, this sunburst comes across us. At Holland on Sea, at an angle from here and some miles distant, a fisherman reels back blinded. A walker is sliced in two. The silver disc came at them edgewise seconds ago. Light that robes us, does it? Limply, as robes do, molded to the frame of nature. It has no furious virtue. What a question.
Yes, it is fun to have those three questions at the end, which are hardly the only bit that is questioning is, does it? Isn't that right?
Yeah.
It has no furious virtue.
It has no furious virtue. That's just
Yes.
It has no furious virtue. I think that's, yeah, it's very unexpected. I find, as he moves away from the set forms, he lands his poems repeatedly in very unexpected places, because he can, he has that room for maneuver.
This isn't a syllabic poem. I notice it's got a lot of sevens and sixes, but it isn't syllabic. So is it free verse, or what is it, Jenny? Do you think? Is it?
I think it's pretty much, yeah, I think it's pretty much free verse, but
Yeah.
very, very sculpted. There's no word wasted there.
No.
But even the fact that, he shortens the last stanza because it emphasizes that the power of that question. And then we're just in white space, He starts to use white space, as his very set forms become disarticulated, white space. The corollary to that is that the white space itself becomes incredibly articulate, and he uses it as an ingredient in the poem really dynamically.
I'm sorry to hasten us along, but I see from my horrible clock, and we only have 8 minutes left, so we better have to scuffle through the remainder of our selection, or cut it slightly.
I think we should cut it slightly if we've only got 8 minutes left. So
yeah. So which one would you like to do next?
Let me think. Do you want to do one? Because I've just talked, Michael, and then I'll read their rectitude, their beauty.
Well, can we go forward, Jazz, to Epistle to Enrique Caracciolo Trejo, and then we'll finish with their rectitude, their beauty, and then we'll leave our audience time to ask questions if they have some. Have a couple here. This Epistle to Enrique Caracciolo Trejo was written about his experience at Essex when he tried to produce a very liberal and open curriculum, and discovered that there was a lot of politics going on that he wasn't prepared for or aware of. And he became disenchanted with the whole more liberal approach that he was taking. Enrique Caracciolo Trejo was a well-known anthologist, and when he speaks of the art you thought to bring us, it is the art of Latin American poetry, which included Neruda, Octavio Paz, and other great Latin American poets who write in a very, very different way. And he's talking about his own writing and about comparing it to their writing. A shrunken world stares from my pages. What a pellet the authentic is. My world of poetry, Enrique, is not large. Day by day, it is smaller. These poems that you have given me, I might have made them English once. It's a question of translation. Now they are inessential. The English that I feel in fears the inauthentic, which invades it on all sides mortally. The style may die of it, die of the fear of it, confounding authenticity with essence. Death, an authentic subject, Jaime Sabines has dressed with the yew trees of funereal trope. It cannot be his fault if the English that I feel in feels itself too poor-spirited to plant a single cypress. It is afraid of showing at the graveside its incapacity to venerate life or the going of it. These are deaths. These qualms and horrors shade the ancestral ground. Sabines, in another poem, comes down to the sound of pigeons on a neighbor's tile, a manifest of gladness. Such a descent on clapping wings the English contrives to trust no longer. My own garden crawls with a kind of obese pigeon from Belgium. They burst through cracking branches like frigate birds. Brief pause here. This line was taken by Philip Larkin to suggest that Davie was hostile to the European Union because this was written around the time of joining Europe. We really briefly like that at the headboard. So, still, in infested gardens, the year goes round. A smiling landscape greets returning spring. To see what can be said for it, on what secure if shallow ground of feeling England stands unshaken for her measure to be taken, has taken 4 bad years of my life here. And now I know the ground. Humiliation, corporate and private, not chastens, but chastises this English and this verse. I cannot abide the new absurdities day by day, the new adulterations. I relish your condition, expatriate, though it be among a people whose constricted idiom cannot embrace the poets you thought to bring them. again, I think that's a tremendously topical poem in lots of ways. You may feel so too, Sinead. I mean, a lot of us might feel that it is almost a contemporary poem. And
it's such a terrific poem of disillusionment, isn't it? It's like, yeah, it's very hard. I like frigate birds.
Yeah. They really do.
It's like ammunition landing, isn't it? Yeah.
I think we really must move on to their rectitude, their beauty, only because it says so much that we were planning to say about his youth with Psalter.
Yeah. So I just wanted to finish with a poem from what I felt was really a late masterpiece by Davie, and it was the late collection To Scorch or Freeze, which is a sequence of poems inspired by the Psalter. And I think that, well, I thought they were very powerful. They are of, you know, they fit into the tradition of religious poetry written in the second half of the 20th century. Some of them really reminded me of R.S. Thomas and his address, his compulsion to address a God who is often absent. So God is absent through these poems. God is very problematic in many of them. You know, there are serious questions about established religion. They are paradoxical. They're very unsettled. And I, as a kind of form of religious poetry, I like their unsettledness and the kind of unease all the way through. But I wanted to finish with one of my favorites from To Scorch or Freeze, which is Their Rectitude, Their Beauty. And it's unusual within that collection because it's a statement of faith, which is actually not, it's not questioned or ironized. And that is kind of exceptional. Most of them are much more hard-hitting than this. But what I think really makes it work as a poem is the little bracketed phrase, having done neither. I think that's the key to this poem really working. So their rectitude, their beauty. The angels rejoice in the excellencies of God, the inferior creatures in his goodness, sinners only in his forgiveness. His polar oppositions, the habitable zones, his clemencies, and his smiling divagations, uncovenanted mercies, who turned the hard rock into a standing water and the flintstone into a springing well. The voice of joy and health is in the dwellings of the righteous. My eyes are running with room from looking for that health in one who has stuck by his testimonies, who has delighted in his regimen, who has run the circuit of his requirements, whose songs in the caravanserai have been about his statutes, not to deserve them or observe them, having done neither, but for the angelic reason, their rectitude, their beauty.
Thank you so much, Sinead. I do want to have one question. There are several questions there, but I would like us just to look at a question that came through from Harry Adams. This will take a couple of minutes for us to answer. I think it says, Michael wrote in Lives of the Poets that Davie believed he had achieved transcendence in his language and penetrated beyond irony with irony. I wonder if Sinead could comment on how Davie achieved transcendence with irony in this way. I said Michael or Sinead, but that's how it's put into your court.
Well, Michael, you began the evening by talking about Davie's you know, configuration of thematic irony and stylistic irony and the differences between them. I have not thought about that, so it might be better if this goes over to you in the first instance, and maybe I can join in with something that you said there.
Well, I think that
I don't know is my initial response to that.
Well, that's fine. I passed the buck to you, and you passed it back to me. I think the notion of thematic irony pervades Davie, and I think the notion in that epistle to Enrique Caracciolo and so on is the notion that the world is more and more, in a sense, hostile, and the hostility is an irony, of course, imposed on it. And that's why his rectitude, their beauty, is such a beautiful poem, because it is acknowledging that, basically, and in some way profoundly accepting it. I guess that may be the answer. I think what I probably meant when I wrote that passage was that he ironizes irony, but I don't think that's the case. I think he accepts the irony as an irony against the self. But
well, he was very aware of how out of step he was, you know, at so many junctures in his career. And then he throws spanners into his own works all the time, within the poems themselves. So, you know, there's a lot of irony being generated in these contrasts and these kind of oppositions, which he can't resolve. And not only does he not resolve them, he problematizes them in very overt ways, doesn't he?
That's right. I mean, I think he believes and is always prodding at him, troubling his belief in those ways, which I find extremely salutary. You don't settle into a happy place.
No, he doesn't let him. He kind of says simultaneously, "I would really like to, but I can't." Yeah. And it's, yes, thank goodness he can't. You know, it's the work is so much better because he can't, and we can't. You know, he's never lazy in his thinking, and you know, we can't be lazy readers of him either. You know, he throws complexity at us all the time.
He makes us a different kind of reader from the kinds of reader that poetry readers of today generally or often are, in the sense that he does demand a lot of us as readers, both in terms of puzzling out what he's saying, but also in terms of a commitment to kinds of truthfulness.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair comment.
I want to thank you enormously, Sinead, for editing this book and writing a wonderful introduction. It gave me a totally new perspective on one of my favorite poets. I would like to thank you all for coming this evening, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Tomorrow you'll receive an email bringing you offers of Christmas joy. And we will also, I'd like to keep the chat room open for a bit longer so you can put your final comments in, but it's been a real pleasure talking with you, Sinead, and I hope other people have shared it, and hearing you read is always a joy. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to do it. I learned a lot. I'm really glad I did it, and I learned a lot. I wish I could have met him, actually. That was the thing I came away with the most.
Well, I hope we, Carcanet and you, have brought him more readers, because I think he could change our reading culture if he was read again. Okay, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Michael.